This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy. Guided by science and grounded by decades of collaborative partnerships, the Nature Conservancy has a long-standing legacy of achieving lasting results to create a world where nature and people thrive. On the fourth Tuesday of every month throughout 2023, Mountain and Prairie will be delving into conversations with a wide range of the Nature Conservancy's leaders, partners, collaborators, and stakeholders, highlighting the myriad of conservation challenges, opportunities, and solutions here in the American West. I'm very excited about this year-long series, and I greatly appreciate the Nature Conservancy's generous support. To learn more about the Nature Conservancy's impactful work in Colorado and around the world, visit www.nature.org/Colorado. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Chris Hawkins. Chris is the Colorado Urban Conservation Manager for the Nature Conservancy, where he leads the organization's efforts in Denver to, quote, solve global challenges like the biodiversity and climate emergencies by supporting and creating more sustainable, efficient ways of living. When many people think of the Nature Conservancy, they may envision large-scale conservation efforts across vast grasslands and wild landscapes. But TNC also conducts some of its most innovative conservation work in cities, work that leads to more resilient, healthy, and equitable communities. Chris's work in Denver is a shining example of how nature-based solutions in densely populated urban areas can have positive ripple effects far beyond the city limits. Chris was born and raised on the East Coast, attended college in Boston, and from the very beginning of his career, he's been focused on service and causes greater than himself. He worked as a Corps Member of AmericaCorps, as Chief of Staff in New York City's Department of Environmental Protection, and for the past 9 years, he's been with the Nature Conservancy. As you'll hear in this conversation, Chris's diverse professional experiences have allowed him to bring a unique and effective perspective to the complex world of urban conservation. Chris was nice enough to join me at my dining room table for an engaging and educational conversation about all things urban conservation. We started out by discussing why TNC has chosen to devote its resources and expertise to conservation in cities, and he explains the unique challenges facing cities here in the American West. We talk about how public health is directly related to people's access to nature, and how the simple but not easy strategy of planting trees in neighborhoods can have huge conservation and public health benefits. As is the case with all of my conservation-related episodes, we discuss the critical importance of relationships and how Chris has managed to build relationships with a diverse group of Denver residents. We also talk about his professional trajectory, the importance of exporting urban conservation ideas to other cities, and the critical roles of mayors and local leadership. And finally, Chris is a serious history buff, so we had a great discussion about books. There's so much fascinating information packed into this episode, and I greatly appreciate Chris's taking the time to share his wisdom with the Mountain and Prairie community. Check out the episode notes for links to everything we discuss. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. All right, Chris, thank you for making the trip down to Colorado Springs for this conversation. I've been excited for it. And I first heard your name. I'm sure we've been in the same room before at some point, but I was in Houston doing an event down there, and I met Jaime Gonzalez, who does similar work that you do in Houston. And he instantly recommended you as a great guest. And so then we were connected, and now here we are. And so Jaime primed me up a little bit for this conversation. I was really interested in what he was doing. And so maybe the easiest way to start this thing is why cities? Because I think when people, the average person on the street, or maybe even listening to this podcast, thinks of Nature Conservancy, they think of planet Earth and big wild landscapes and big animals and all the, nature. But there's so much important work to be done in cities that you're doing on a daily basis. Why cities for TNC?
Yeah, great question. And, even before jumping into that, Jaime is such a great connector. He deserves a ton of credit for the awesome work that they're doing down in Texas. One of the better, I think, connectors and champions in this space. So certainly go check out what they're doing in Houston. Yeah, why cities? I think that's a great question. And it's one that I've certainly been thinking about for the 6 years I've been in this role. I think you're 100% right that TNC, the Nature Conservancy, classically has been, an organization focused on protecting lands and waters. And I think one of the overarching themes that I come back to is that cities are conservation strategies unto themselves, right? So we are unlikely to get protection, restoration of large landscapes right and balance at a global level of human development and resource consumption unless we figure out how to make cities thriving places where people want to be. And the upside of cities, the benefit of cities, is that they provide significant advantages over other human development patterns that reduce human resource consumption, they reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they consume less land when we think about physical footprint. And so from that perspective, cities, again, are conservation strategies where if we get those right, we are more likely to get the protection of large landscapes, protection of creatures we care about, species we care about at the global level, get that right. And there's the upside of potentially providing people more fulfilling, connected, exciting lives than we do in other human development patterns.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And so that's kind of the really zoomed out view of all cities. And then when you zoom into cities in the West, that presents a completely unique set of challenges. It was interesting. When I was down in Houston, I was looking around and it was February, but it seemed compared to here, like I was in the tropics, and I think the number of challenges that they deal with is vastly different. Even though it's just a, hour and a half plane ride or something, 2 hour plane ride from here, they got hurricanes, they've got too much water, all that kind of stuff. Talk about thriving cities in the West and how that is the unique set of challenges and opportunities that come with that.
Yeah, another great question. And I think you're nailing some of it in that obviously one of the biggest issues is water demand. Our issues around just, especially on the Front Range of here in Colorado, draw on the Colorado River. And I do think that cities compared to other development patterns where we're really thinking about some of the high drivers in urban areas, suburban areas of consumption, reducing things like irrigated lawns, stuff like that. Cities tend to have less of those in their development patterns. So that's certainly unique to the arid West. I think another interesting aspect of cities, Western cities, is they tend to be younger, right? So it's always funny to me to think about driving around Denver, where, our family calls home, what that looked like just 200 years ago. It was largely undeveloped. You had indigenous native populations here, but it was not the space it is now. And those development patterns, specifically in Denver, kind of a creep eastward, are encroaching on what are still, thriving and wild ecosystems. And that's a very different circumstance than you see, let's say in East Coast cities where everything for the most part within the city boundary and adjacent is developed. Mm-hmm. And so it's a different set of circumstances. So yeah, I think there's some really interesting opportunities when it comes to water demand, development patterns, opportunities for protection, restoration, and really elevating those ecosystems that are still intact and undeveloped, and thinking about the species that call those home and people who depend on those for kind of those mental health, physical health, spiritual benefits of access to nature.
In your time at TNC, so you said 6 years, how much has the mental health aspect of nature and the importance of nature as a tool for just general human health, has that kind of come to the forefront more? Because just from my perspective on the outside, I feel like I hear about it a lot more. There are a lot more books written about it. It's more of a topic of conversation. Has that become more of a focus of your work on a yearly basis, I guess?
Yeah, a great question again. And so, I've been in Colorado chapter leading this program, the city's program, for about 6 years, about 9 years at TNC overall. And I was lucky to be part of our global cities team, where we were engaged in some of our certainly with our lead scientist around this. And I think one thing that has happened over the last 10 years is that you've seen what was I think growing and maybe still young kind of body of evidence, science-based evidence base around the mental health, physical health, all the other, kind of aspects around access to nature, time in nature. And I think that was still maybe immature 10 years ago. Now that evidence base is so robust and thriving that there's no longer, I think, any scientific discussion around the merits and the demonstrable benefits of access to nature, again, from the physical health, mental health, just all over well-being, let alone economic vitality and managing all kinds of ecosystem and providing all kinds of ecosystem services. I'm on an email chain by a great researcher in this space, and I get daily updates.
Who's that researcher?
His name is Payam Davidad. I could actually certainly connect you at some point and put that in your kind of inbox, but he just has this chain where he shares journal articles out of scientific publications, and it's every day. I mean, every day I'm seeing, one or two newly published academic pieces that just continue to validate all of this hypothesis around just the economic value, the physical, mental health value of access to nature. So we're in an interesting space where I think, back to kind of the root of your question around TNC and how we've been engaged, at least in thinking about health and the connection to this, I think there are certainly ties to the health community. I think we've been having some of that conversation more frequently with those in the health community about how we position nature as a right, access to nature as a right that all humans deserve, how we think about strategies like prescriptions to nature. So physicians being able to actually prescribe people access to nature and therefore denying access to nature as being something that's against their medical need.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I think there is a really interesting space there. We've been having some of that conversation, and that certainly has shifted over the last 10 years. If I can share one other example, the Nature Conservancy in Louisville, Kentucky was engaged in the first ever science-based project that had an interventional component to how we make this case. And so most of what you see out there in kind of the scientific space around health and well-being and nature tends to be, either based on correlation or other kind of evidence that you're able to say because, this person has more access, therefore they tend to have lower stress, et cetera. But that's all correlative. This was the first ever interventional study. So the way the study worked was that they did all kinds of different monitoring on different health indicators. So whether it was stress, the amount of times that people use their asthma, their inhalers, other indicators in blood work as well. And they intervened with some significant investments in nature in some of the communities in Louisville. And we're able to demonstrate that there is an evidence base for intervention when it comes to using nature to actually reduce people's stress and improve their health and well-being. So it's a really fascinating space. I think I'm hopeful that we're moving on from just studying it and really focusing on how do we get these public health intervention of access to nature into the real world and real world adoption and application.
Yeah. There's a book by an author named Florence Williams called The Nature Fix. She's actually going to come on the podcast soon, hopefully. I remember I read that book, and it was one of these deals where I kind of felt like I knew all this stuff. You know that being outside is good for you, and you know that, when you spend time outdoors, you feel better. But I didn't have any scientific proof. So I felt like it was one of these books that just is kind of good for the ego. Like it confirmed everything I thought with science. But I always recommend that to people. I think there's another one called Last Child in the Woods that I've heard great things about.
Yeah, both of those are great. Yep. Both of those have made, and I think really socialized, I think the evidence base and the need and just the human right to have access to nature.
It's so wild how I've been thinking a lot about just technology and all the promises of technology. And it seems like with every new iteration of technology, it's this promise that's going to make everything better. And then we just come back around to, well, the natural way is probably best to begin with. So when I was preparing for this, I was looking and there's so much great information online about everything you do. but I found one thing, and it kind of a summary of the things that, and this may be outdated, so correct me if the focus has changed, but it was the three main things that you're trying to work on are heat, sprawl, and inequity. And those buckets cover most of the stuff you've done or that you work on. And one of the big things I saw online a lot about was trees and what a difference trees can make in pretty much every aspect of life in a city. Very open-ended question, but talk to me about trees.
Yeah, happily. And what I would say is that I think that, heat, sprawl, and equity certainly shorthand for, I think, the issues we're trying to address, but I think also capture pretty thoroughly where we are in our kind of strategic niche. Trees are huge. Trees and, I think the issues around tree canopy inequity in a place like Denver are real. Trees, in getting back to, in some ways the question you answered or asked earlier around what makes, these Western cities unique. One thing that makes them unique is that investment in trees has a little bit higher return on investment than other places because we have a semi-arid climate, right? So we don't have that humidity that kind of captures that heat and just makes it, just kind of ever present on your body, right? And so when you're in a shaded space, what we tend to see is about a 15-degree difference in shaded. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. And oftentimes what you'll see in some of the data out there is that it takes more of a city-wide perspective. So you'll see things like shaded areas and cities with increased tree canopy are 1.5 to 2 degrees cooler. And I think that's valuable to know at the kind of a system-wide scale. I think one thing that is really important when we think about interventions, especially in a city space, is what does that actually mean for humans on the ground, right? And so I think that 15-degree difference is huge. So that means that on a 95-degree day in the sun, you're experiencing 80 in the shade, right? Pretty significant. And then if we think about the inequity across a place like Denver, but this is comparable to cities across the country, those inequities tend to fall across, typical kind of demographic, socioeconomic lines. So poorer communities tend to have significantly less trees. Yep. And in Denver, that means that communities at the lower end of that distribution tend to have about 5% tree canopy cover. And those which tend to be wealthier, whiter communities tend to have about 35 to 40% tree canopy cover. So you start doing some of that kind of back of the envelope math around that 15-degree kind of lived experience, stepping outside, walking around, having your kiddos recreate outside, going to the bus stop, getting groceries, and then you do that kind of, you're likely to be in a 15-degree hotter area 7 times more of your time outside.
Which is really miserable.
It's miserable. And you start to have some really significant public health impacts around that, right? So when we think about trees, I mean, one of the questions that comes up all the time is, are you planting native trees? Like, is this appropriate given that we were a short grass prairie? I think fundamental thing that I come back to is we're in an altered landscape at this point, right? This is no longer the ecosystem it was. I think there are many ways for us to honor that and to support species that are still calling this home, that are native. But we are now a human kind of dominated landscape trying to figure out how we integrate nature in a way that, certainly supports the natural world, but then also makes this a more livable place for humans so that we're not exacerbating things like sprawl and forcing people who, otherwise can't afford to be living in cities, an hour out. So then they're, driving their car more and they're using more water in their lawns, et cetera. So I think trees play a fundamentally critical role in making our cities more livable, making them more equitable, and ultimately more economically viable, climate resilient, community resilient, and more inspiring too, just being able to see the natural world around you in a way that places with less trees don't provide.
Well, this is maybe a dumb question, but that's why I have the podcast, because I get to ask the dumb questions. Who loses? I mean, I don't understand what the downside is to more trees. I mean, I guess there possibly somebody could say they take a lot of water, which is, that's probably valid. But otherwise, it seems like a win-win across the board, whether you're talking about economics, whether you're talking about public health, just the general vibe of a city that's probably maybe hard to measure. But like when you're doing this work, like say in Denver, trying to plant more trees, who is the resistance? Like what is the resistance? Is it just maybe there's not individuals, or is it just inertia, just general inertia, and also you're dealing with a very long-term project. It takes a long time for trees to grow.
Great questions.
Yeah, what's the resistance?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of everything. And, I think there are even questions still in the scientific community around water consumption when it comes to trees, because I do think that's one thing that we come up against a lot, right? It's going to, if I plant a tree, it's going to need a bunch of water, and it's going to be, more expensive for me, or this is inappropriate in a semi-arid climate where we are, experiencing system-wide drought. I think there are actually questions around that. So, for example, a great researcher formerly out of Colorado State University, a woman named Melissa McHale, looked at 66,000 homes across Denver in partnership with Denver Water. Her conclusion was that in looking at consumption and establishment of trees, homes that had trees that provided shade, especially with homes that had grass turf lawns, which are unlikely to go away in the near term, used overall less water than homes that did not have a tree but still had a grass turf lawn, right? So that net benefit of the tree on reduced water demand was actually still there. And so I think, that as an example of, I think, one aspect of, a system of beliefs and even disinvestment is one. And then thinking a little bit kind of more along those lines, I think there are other challenges. So some of those are that typically government entities that would fund or put trees in places where they're available or allowed to, right? So in Denver, that's the public right-of-way, parks. Public right-of-way is considered 10 feet off of the curb. Those typically haven't been funded well, right? And, parks departments tend to be at the bottom of the kind of pecking order when you're getting your general fund sorted out and you're looking at budget cuts. The Nature Conservancy, with a host of partners back in 2018, passed a ballot measure that creates, it's a 0.25% sales tax, will generate in the near term about $45 million a year. And that has no sunset. It would have to go away, would have to be reversed by the voters. That can't supplant the existing parks and recreation capital budget. So it's in addition to, and that's huge. That means that their budget goes from being, $20 to $25 million a year to around 60 to 70 a year in perpetuity. And so that's a great opportunity to overcome, what has been a barrier, where now we can really advocate and push and work with our city partners to come up with ways to invest in trees in places that they are kind of allowed to. But that gets to another challenge, right? So another challenge is just property rights and management and, where we can use public funding, right? So typically private property, you can't use public funding. It's just a little bit more challenging because you're using, public capital for a private benefit. So that, I think, just highlights how a lot of this is systemic. And then there are other issues too, right? So for example, in some of the communities where we're doing some community-led greening, you have really challenging historical economic drivers, right? So for example, in Globeville, Elyria, Swansea, there's a long history going back to the founding of Denver where they had a significant amount of meatpacking, but then also smelter operations.
Oh, wow. I didn't
in the
realize
community.
that.
So, when kind of the gold, silver rush happened, they would bring a lot of the ore down to Denver to be refined. It would enter those refineries. They would be burned in those, and a lot of the heavy metals would come up through the smokestacks and then deposit locally right in the community, right? And so over the past, 15, 20 years, there have been significant remediation through Superfund and other remediation efforts. And what that led to for many folks in the community was, one, I think very much a distrust of kind of what is in their soils. Second, there was a whole effort to replace the top, let's call it 6-8 inches of topsoil. So about 95% of the people in the community have had their topsoil removed and replaced over
And
the
is
past
that like
20
a
years.
super fun type project?
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
And so that means folks have all kinds of different soil now. There's an inherent skepticism around, what is in their soil. Can I plant something? And then for a lot of folks too, you get back to things like tree removal, replacement. A lot of these lots are tighter, so you have physically less space. Sure. The tree lawns, the space between the sidewalk and the curb, tends to be narrow. Trees really need a lot of soil to grow to maturity and not die off. And so you have this confluence of factors, right, where you have, a city that might not previously have had funding to put towards this. And those are challenging places to plant because of, lot size. And maybe the community doesn't want to take on a tree because it's, whether true or not, unlikely to survive. And if it does die, they might face a lien from the city if they don't, remove it and pay their fee. And so you get this real interesting confluence of factors, I think, that we've been lucky and privileged to be part of trying to chip away at. And what I'd say is that I think Denver's in an incredible spot right now where between the ballot measure I noted and another one that supports our Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency, some federal funding, some incredible partnerships on the ground, community leaders. I think you're at a real pivotal moment where I think investment in urban forestry and doing so in a way that is community-led and honors community voice and agency, I think is going to be kind of the next step. And really hoping that, this will be a testing ground and a national model for how we do this right in support of community resilience.
There's several things in there I want to follow up on.
Yeah, there's a lot.
I love it. I love it, man. It's all super, super interesting to me. And I didn't know anything about the smelting stuff.
Yeah, it's a rich history, and it's one that I find so compelling, right? Because it back to kind of who benefits and why is this and why hasn't it happened? I mean, it gets back to the historical roots of these places. And so understanding some of that history provides, I think, just deeper connection to place and ultimately the people who currently call these places home, and why environmental justice and issues really are issues that if we address them can benefit all of us, right? I mean, we need people who are able to stay in those communities to really make our communities thriving and resilient and diverse and culturally rich and all of that.
Well, one thing that's become clear in all these conversations I've had with folks at Nature Conservancy, and it was clear the very first time I talked to Carlos in 2020, is that everything TNC does is built on this foundation of relationships, whether you're talking about rural areas on the Colorado River or far out, in the high plains, what Matt and Galen were talking about. And, really everything, even Dr. Hayhoe, who came on and was talking about trying to overturn some of the pushback on climate change. And the whole way you do that is by building relationships. And everything you've just been saying, used to keep talking about building relationships and having it be community driven. Who are some of your trusted partners in these things? I mean, how do you go about building these relationships? Because in the end, it's the same idea, but it's building relationships in the middle of urban Denver, city of millions of people, is a lot different than building it out in eastern Colorado. So can you talk about that process? Because I would imagine that's probably your biggest focus on a daily basis.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you're highlighting that. I think one of the things, this relationship-based approach is so fundamental, and it's core, right? I think it is part of why the Nature Conservancy has been able to grow our impact. I'll probably get in trouble for saying some of this, but we often, when we talk about our organization and who we are, we often talk about how we're science-based, and we have, significant staff who are scientists, and we publish, and all of that is fantastic. We talk about how we're nonpartisan. I think that's a component there around being relationship-based. But I think leading with how we are relationship-based, and I think really thinking about how we can be community-based environmental problem solvers with that global lens, but with that backing around, why we're engaging, using our science to lead and to partner and to do so in a way that's meaningful on the ground is core. And so I appreciate you raising that, because I think that is one of our core strengths that I think sometimes we forget to highlight. And I think you're right. It comes back to our earliest land protection work. So much of that is based on trust and relationship and finding out what's meaningful to people where they are and how we help them treasure that and protect that and have lives that are meaningful. To your question around what does that mean in an urban space, right? I think, TNC has been like much of the conservation and environmental space for a long time. It's been classically white male led. TNC's roots go back to 1951, 1955 here in Denver or in Colorado. And I think for a long time, time that has meant that we probably looked one way, and that probably worked really well in a lot of communities where we were engaging, simply because I think we were, able to show up in a way that was kind of trusted, et cetera. I think one thing that's interesting about cities is that they are home to many more kind of racially diverse identities, people. And I think one thing that we need to really think about as we show up is, how do we show up in a space that likely has skepticism around bigger green environmental organizations, white male-led spaces? How do we show up authentically, humbly? How do we bring allyship and support in a way that can be still led by communities that look and feel different than a lot of the big green space? How do we, I think, listen is really important, and listen with intent to, I think, honor and be able to act in support of organizations. And then how do we make that commitment internally to bringing on different people who are, of different racial backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, gender, sexual identities. And I would say that has been a commitment I've seen over the last, 10 years here at the Nature Conservancy broadly. And then in the Colorado chapter, a real commitment that's really landed in, I think, some hiring that we've done. And, from a personal perspective, I am definitely a white cisgender male. And so when I show up in a lot of communities, I think there's fair skepticism. I'm lucky and privileged to be half Latino. And so while I look white and have all of the privilege and benefit of being, white male in this space, I think and certainly showing up and honoring that. I think because of my grandma and the time we spent together early on, my Spanish speaking is actually fairly strong, and more than grammatically strong. It's just my tongue sounds more native. Sure. And more fluent. And so I think that's often a surprise sometimes in those spaces. And I think it's one of those that I think being able to kind of share that part of myself and do so in a way at the right time, right?
Yeah, not just leading with, hey, watch this.
I think you don't want to, exactly. Yeah. But I think not in an alienating way, but I think with that, again, intent around partnership, support, allyship, and saying, like, I am here and I want to bring this part of me to this space is, I think, something that I think we've been thinking about as we bring on new staff. How do we bring on folks who really lean into that aspect of relationship building, and again, bringing in different voices into a space that's been less diverse classically, especially as we try to tackle some of these more systemic changes that just require more diversity of perspective in life.
So you hit on this a bit, but I'd like to hear more. In my experience, I'm from North Carolina. And a lot of my conservation work, it's, me, a white guy dealing with other white guy landowners, farmers, ranchers. But still, I'm an outsider. When they hear me talk, they're like, this guy from around here. Right. Who is this guy? What does he want? And, I've had many interactions that are just could be straight up almost like hostile. Like they're thinking I'm coming in to play some game, especially when I was in the real estate business, because odds are, I dealt with a lot of scumbags back then. So anyway, the way that I was able to kind of build a genuine relationship with people who may be skeptical is just by being genuinely curious. And I think Matt Moorhead talked about this in our last episode. Just this, because I am. Hey, tell me about everything. Tell me about, when did your family come here? And that was kind of my technique. And when I say technique, it sounds like maybe it was disingenuous or something, but not at all. But that was a way that I was able to build trust with people so that we could do great things together. How do you, personally, what is your technique for building trust with these people? You mentioned the Spanish speaking, which I think is awesome. My wife is very fluent in Spanish. I'm so jealous of that. And it shows a level of respect, I feel like. Any other techniques you have for building trust? Because I think that's a skill that anybody, no matter what business you're in, you can use that. Anything come to mind? Yeah.
It's probably a lot of the classic stuff, which is just, I think, showing up consistently, showing up and listening, being curious, showing up ideally without a set agenda. Yeah. And if you do have an agenda, be really transparent about it. Say, hey, here's the opportunity. Here's what we're bringing to the table, or here's our long-term intent, right? So I often share with our community partners, our goal in Denver is to put all communities on a path to a climate resilient urban tree canopy. And so that means that I am always going to bring that lens to the work that we're doing maybe in one neighborhood. So I'm always going to be thinking, all right, how might this translate to a community, further west or south, or how would that connect with that partner, or how can we demonstrate something in a community that is ultimately going to influence city policy or city funding. But I think being candid, right, the whole time through about our intent and goals, and allowing that, I think, leadership and community agency and voice. And so I think whether that comes down to how meetings are structured or how we provide time for listening and ask questions, how we try to show up with resources that ultimately we say are for the community to really decide on and honor that and put guardrails around that, right? And there are all kinds of, I think, forces that want to influence how funds get used, et cetera. But I think it's really always important to speak to, champion, and I think guard against, and also honor that commitment of community voice and community action. And I think the more we're able to do that consistently, I think with partners, especially community-based organizations, the more that trust, I think, grows. And, I think one of the things that a lot of, and I'm sure this is true in the ranching community, many others, but some of the communities we work in get way too many groups wanting to do work. And I think there is significant fatigue in a lot of communities of like having my door knocked on again, or another survey, or another group coming in with an agenda. And so I think there's real strong right to skepticism, and just, I'm tired of this kind of thing. Like last time I engaged with a group, they didn't deliver, or
they disappeared.
And I think that is certainly a privilege and a benefit of being part of a large organization, is that, I can carve out time to say, hey, I need to go to this public meeting. It's not going to maybe advance another project priority, but if we want to go long, ultimately, it's going to be really important that I'm just present and listening. So I think those are, and I'm sure that those are all components that translate to any space. And I think, again, I really appreciate you raising that, because I do think that sometimes we think about the work that, we do in cities as distinct that we're doing, in another space, our land work or our fire work or oceans, and it all comes back to relationship. And I think that always tears apart so many other constructs that are out there, the kind of polarizing voices we hear all the time around issues, and gets back to that core humanity, right?
Yeah. In a way, it's like we were talking about it with it all comes back to natural solutions. And no matter how fancy the science gets and the monitoring and the ability to forecast, in the end, none of it works without just the basic human relationship. Yeah. And I think that's an advantage. Again, I'm on the outside. I'm not an expert. If TNC may disagree, but I feel like one of the advantages that TNC has is it seems that when people go to work at TNC, more times than not, they're there for a long period of time, which speaks to the organization and the culture, and that it's a fun place to work. But you can't beat that year in, year out showing up. Like I feel like in my closest experience is everything in Eastern Colorado, and, Matt Moorhead being out there for 25 years and being a fixture, that you can't fake that. There's no way around it. No. And I feel like you've been doing that for 6 years in Denver, and that's a long time as people come and go and switch jobs. And so I don't know, you can't fake it.
You can't, no.
It's very powerful. So how did you end up doing this work? Where'd you grow up?
Yeah, I grew up in New York, New Jersey area, born in Texas, an Army brat. My father's side of the family is from out here in Colorado, so I've certainly felt a connection out here. My wife's from out here, so it was always a place that we had in mind. But yeah, I grew up in New York, New Jersey.
Was outdoors a big part of your life?
Yeah, I think in a pretty kind of typical classic kind of way, right? So, whether it was just being able to have ready access in a suburban community.
I lived in a ditch for like middle school years, like played in a ditch, catching frogs. Like that was it.
I think that's right. I mean, just running around outside, that was kind of a daily fixture of our life. And, a lot of that was kind of like big lawns, but that's still outside, and that's still access that many people don't have. And so that's not kind of the classic, like, connection to a diverse, wide range of biodiversity necessarily, but regardless, the benefits of nature were there. Certainly had a lot of access through, camping, fishing, hiking, throughout kind of our life. I grew up swimming, my whole life. So that, I think, connection and draw to water, I think, has been something that's carried, whether, regardless of most of that time being in kind of indoor pools, it has carried through, I think, comfort in kind of.
Were you pretty competitive swimmer?
I swam through college. I was not good, but able to at least be on a team.
No, you were good. There's no way around it.
And so, swam distance, horrible at everything else. But it was, I think, has made me feel very comfortable in those spaces. And so that's always been a connection. And then, how I got into this work, I think I've always been drawn in some way to public service. Spent some time after college, so studied psychology and environmental studies in college. Spent some time in some AmericaCorps programs after college. The first was an AmericaCorps program on Cape Cod. If you're of age and listening, do that program if you can.
So what was your job? Like, what did you do?
Yeah, so got to live in an old captain's house.
I've never been to Cape Cod, but I hear it's just awesome.
It's great. It's a beautiful space. It has a lot of protected spaces, whether they're from the town, county, or Cape Cod National Seashore. My job really varied, and I think that was what was so compelling about it, right? So, you're not getting paid much, but you have a wonderful crew of folks to live with, learn with, and it spent 2 days a week doing something in the field. So whether that was removing invasive species, restoring sand dunes, doing prescribed burns, all of that was valuable across.
Was it kind of like a youth corps type thing?
Very much, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's, a lot of the kind of concept around AmeriCorps is this kind of extension of, the Civilian Conservation Corps kind of 1920s era. And so spent about half of the time doing kind of in the field, more community-oriented work, spent about half my time working with a park planner in Cape Cod National Seashore. So got to kind of think about stuff from more of that policy planning, how you think about larger transformational change. And I think that balance is something that's carried through, right? So I think one thing that I really treasure about working at kind of that city level of government is that you're able to think at that kind of higher level around things like policy planning, funding, finance, but it also really lands impactfully, visibly, transformationally in a space that you can call home. I think I've been a little averse to engaging kind of at the state level stuff, federal stuff, just because to me, sometimes those arcs of change are too political and, too long. That doesn't mean that those aren't incredibly transformational, right? I mean, right now we're looking at an influx of $1.5 billion into urban community forestry from, the federal government. Some amazing people made that happen.
Sure,
right?
sure.
For me, though, that the kind of municipal government space has always been that right balance, that kind of Goldilocks of being able to be kind of on the ground in community, thinking about community needs at that local level, and then thinking about how that translates into just how you manage, create policy that's equitable and, actually addresses some of that, how you can pilot things on the ground.
And see the results.
And feel them. I mean, I love being able to kind of walk around the city that we call home and actually, see things where it might not be, our direct impact, but I know the grant and the, that went out to kind of create that training.
No, that's powerful. And when you think about, I've talked to some folks that are mayors of towns of different sizes, and I always ask them, like, so you're going to try to be a senator? And a lot of them say, I have no interest in that because I like working here, being, the head person, helping to make things happen that I can see happen. And when you go up to the next level and, to each their own, but for these certain people that love their community and love making difference that they can see, going and doing something on a broad scale across a big area, it just doesn't do it for them. There are a lot of people that it would be the opposite, and so we need both. But I think there's something really cool about being zoned in on your own community.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, you'll have to get former mayor, former governor, current senator Hickenlooper on.
Yeah, I'd love to hear his take on that.
I'm sure he has a great take on that balance. And
it's got to be weird because he's been such a doer and getting things done on, and now I couldn't imagine the change, but he's a resilient, you couldn't have the success he's had in so many different levels, from entrepreneurship to local government to federal government. That might be a goal.
Yeah, I think that's a great goal. And some of the other things I talk about when I think earlier on, and still a little bit, kind of had to make the case for, why is TNC engaging in cities? And so some of the things I come back to, right, are things like what I said earlier, conservation strategies unto themselves and, how, right? So resource consumption, greenhouse gas emissions. There are other components there too that are really real, right? Like cities are connected and competitive. Mm-hmm. And so I think in that competitive space, cities look to each other for innovation. They are trying to get people to live in their cities. Mm-hmm. They're trying to entice corporate, headquarters partners to be in their cities. They're trying to increase that economic diversity. They're trying to become more resilient. Those are just inherent components of cities. And so I think those aspects alone, let alone kind of the administrative components, make them just vibrant, dynamic places where innovation is just kind of inherent in their core existence. And so it encourages things like, one thing I talk about often, right, is congestion pricing in London, where they basically made a circle around the city and said, if you're going to drive your car into the core area where we're seeing tons of congestion that's, slowing our city down, causing human health impact, it's, decreasing the economic vitality of our city. If you're going to do that, you're going to pay a charge, and we're going to figure this out, right? And that's something that kind of innovation is really challenging at the state level. It's really, really challenging at the federal level, but mayors are empowered to act often and have incentives to. And so I think figuring out how we use our relationships, our access, our influence to, I think, nudge cities, do so in a way that leans into that connected, competitive component. And I think ultimately makes all of our cities more vibrant and sustainable and resilient, I think is only in our collective benefit in ultimately preserving some of those big, large landscapes. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting insight in the conversations kind of with mayors there, but I can see that, right? It's that ability to act quickly, innovate, and do so in a space that allows, I think, for failure and is real. And
there's some accountability to it too, like the guy, I actually had him on the podcast, Yemi, who's running for mayor of Colorado Springs, and he lives one block from me, and our kids go to school together, and he very well is going to win. I mean, he's in the runoff now. And I think about his house is on kind of a main thoroughfare. And if he wins, if there's a pothole, everybody knows right where the mayor is. Absolutely. And they can go there and complain. And so, and I think given how responsibility can kind of be diffused through the internet and all that kind of stuff, I mean, there's no escaping, even in a city of 500,000 people, everybody knows where the mayor lives.
That's exactly right. And I think that is also the opportunity that is so fulfilling when you are able to make change. I think back a little bit to, so I spent some time in New York City government in 3 different spaces in their Office of Charter Schools, which was kind of a more innovative space within education. I spent a little bit of time interning grad school in their Office of Sustainability, and then a bulk of my time there in the water utility. So it's an integrated water utility. They manage all the way up from the watershed, delivery to the city, treatment, and then wastewater treatment management, all that. And, I think about, this is going on about 10, 11 years now. We were trying to introduce, because of our Clean Water Act mandates, et cetera, and what that was going to traditionally require us to do. So, $3-4 billion investments that would raise water rates. We were trying to introduce what I would basically call rain gardens. So think about the sidewalk, you cut, an inlet in the sidewalk, you create a little space that you dig down, and then you put, vegetation and soils in there. It allows rainwater to come in, infiltrate into the soil, and then if it needs to, it leaves through, an outlet. But what that does is that just decreases, the idea is that it treats some of that water more close to home in a passive, natural way. It creates opportunity for a new tree and more soil space, and then it also decreases the peak demand on the sewer system. Sewer system in New York City, when it overflows, just releases raw sewage into the waterways, right? In the West, that's different. So another difference in how Western cities tend to be is that our Clean Water Act obligations are different. Long story short, we took some time because we had an administration at the time that was really open to innovation, really open to, pushing back on kind of our federal mandates and trying innovative ways to kind of move forward more natural solutions to stormwater management. We stood up, made a lot of the kind of scientific economic case for this to our regulators, thinking about a more natural kind of distributed set of solutions to stormwater management. We started to pilot some of those within the city. So we built a few rain gardens in the city. We worked with engineers to, understand how those were working. Then we, did some neighborhood testing, right? So we took a whole street, put a bunch of those rain gardens on the street, and then we looked at flows of water during rain events before and afterwards, and ultimately got this into kind of the standard set of practices within the city. So that took a while, right? That body of work that I've just described probably took 5-6 years. And so over those 5-6 years, let's say we installed about 25 of them. You look at New York City right now, that has become a standard piece of infrastructure, like a streetlight, fire hydrant. There are more than 10,000 of those rain gardens installed across the city. And you can go look at a map. They have the map online of all those installed, all those planned. Cool. There are incredible stories around, how communities have kind of embraced that, have been able to, see butterflies in their communities now. And this is an ultra-urban space, right?
As urban as gets.
As ultra-urban, political, et cetera, but it comes back to that leadership, that commitment from an administration to say, we are going to try something new. I am going to, take on this fight and, whatever this repercussion is with kind of our federal partners in this. And we're going to innovate and we're going to learn. And we've seen, really significant impact there. And so I think coming back to kind of that tangibility, right? I think that's a great example where there's real community, human impact, lived impact around, people being able to see that. And then maybe there's some, kind of deeper connection for folks around, all right, why is this here? Well, how does this connect with, our sewer system and natural space? What kind of tree is that? Where else can I find those trees? What kind of butterfly was that? Where is it coming from? Where is it going? I think all of those are things that the natural world just so, I think, inherently compels our like human curiosity in a way that I'm sure other things do, right? But I think it's just so core to, I think, our humanity that is really compelling. And I think cities provide some of that in a way that, or can provide some of that. There's so much potential in the way we think about our cities.
One of the many cool things about that story you told is that I would imagine that now that because New York City was willing to put in the work and the effort and the upfront work and all the investment required to figure out, all right, is this going to work? Yes, it does. Now that can be exported to other cities,
Absolutely.
which is the real power. I mean, everybody wants their place to be better, but when you can, multiply that over a lot of different cities. And so that brings me back to Denver. Do you have any ideas? I mean, does anything come to mind as either something that TNC and you and your partners have worked on here that has been exported to other cities, a great idea, or something that you have been able to use from a different city? Because I always hear about Las Vegas as being a place that has figured out how to do water consumption the right way, and they're able to export that to other Western cities. But does anything come to mind either that has gone out or come into Denver?
Yeah, great question. I think there are a few opportunities on the fore. I think there's definitely a good example of a complete whiff on integrating something from another
There's a lot
city.
of lessons to be learned with whiffs.
A lot of lessons to be learned. And so, I'll share a little bit of that. I think as I shared earlier, I think because of some of the enabling conditions and barriers that the citizens of Denver in some ways have decided they want to overcome, I think the city and county of Denver and the region are really well poised to make deeper investments in urban forestry, thinking about it as, something that's community-led and supports community and climate resilience. And so again, there are two ballot measures I noted, but they're generating about $90 million a year.
That's a lot of money.
For parks, rivers, trails, and trees. That's one half of it. The other half is around climate adaptation, sustainability, and resiliency. But those do come together in some really meaningful ways where you're seeing the city be able to fund private property trees, something that they inherently and classically probably wouldn't have done. Or another grant that went out just last year to a lot of community partners is to create climate ambassadors in some of the neighborhoods where you're seeing some of the highest impact of climate change. Yeah. And so I think those are some elements that are they're nascent, right? This is just kind of coming around. But most sustainability offices across the country do not have a $40 to $45 million capital budget to do all kinds of innovative granting. And most parks and rec offices don't have a citizen-directed revenue source that will allow them to dream big many years out. And so I think those two are a big benefit. And I think that is something that, as we've been thinking about our role, our credibility, our reputation, being able to stand up and say to our partners, our members, other adjacent organizations that these ballot measures are really important in creating transformative, high leverage opportunities, long-term opportunities that will make our cities more resilient, make our parks and counties more resilient. I mean, you see, we've certainly engaged partnered with groups like Trust for Public Land, Colorado Cattlemen's Association, others on thinking about how we manage our open spaces, protect them for the long haul. So I think those are examples that we've certainly leveraged locally. An example where we totally whiffed as a city, but there are great learnings there. Are about 6 years ago, some just incredible advocates who I think had nothing but the right intent, but I think didn't totally understand all the local dynamics. Passed what was called a green roof ordinance, so that required that any new building have a green roof and some component of solar on the top of the building. Green roofs just don't thrive and have really. So a green roof, again, is for folks, is a vegetated roof that tends to have, let's say, 6 to 18 inches of soil and vegetation on top. The idea is that it creates possibly some habitat, but stormwater management, et cetera. They make a lot of sense and make more economic sense in places like Seattle, Portland, high precipitation
rain,
where you have 50 inches a year. Denver's lucky to get 14 inches a year, right? So there was, I think, this great intent around that. Citizens of Denver, I think, saw that and said, this sounds awesome, right? Like, I'm sure this is vetted. It passed. I think that did was, I think it, in some ways, created interesting narratives around, and I think entrenched perspectives around, the development community saying, this is definitely not what we want. But that only exacerbated some narratives around, like, oh, this is development communities not progressive and thinking about more sustainable development, right? What happened in that case was that basically the city property owners, et cetera, had to sit down after it passed with those who had it pass and say, okay, you've gotten this through. How can we honor the intent and make this feasible? There had to be a 6-month working group. It is now called the Green Building Ordinance and creates all kinds of different pathways to compliance, right? Like building efficiency, et cetera. Again, great intent. And so I think what I'd say there is that I think there's a role for the Nature Conservancy. We were just starting our kind of presence in the city at that point. There's a role for the Nature Conservancy in leveraging our networks, our presence, our ability to show up consistency, our relationships, and our science and our kind of nonpartisan, intent and orientation to help, I think, guide some of that. And again, like, how do we, instead of, I think, entrenching and polarizing kind of narratives that only push people away from a place of common collective goals, how do we bring more people to the table, those relationships, those kind of unique relationships we're lucky and privileged to have, before something just kind of gets passed and becomes a bombshell? So, I would share that as maybe a local learning, but I think, again, back to some of our strengths and why I enjoy working in this space and why I think a lot of folks do, and that it really is about problem solving. And it's about not, I think, making people feel, bad or, I think other aspects that I think, have value in some spaces of the environmental space, but I think that's just not our orientation. But I think it comes back to kind of how we show up and is a learning for, I think, us locally and I think across our city's network around, opportunities for us to kind of intervene and maybe move things forward in a way that might land towards more impact and kind of more relationship, kind of community resilience in the long haul. So again, a long-winded answer, but
no, that's great. I love that. And it's funny because, a lot of my work for quite a while was trying to, fundraise around conservation initiatives that can be replicated. But that's really the first time I've thought about the real lessons, very, very valuable, maybe even more valuable than the wins, can come from some of the things that didn't work out as planned. As long as people are willing to share. I think there sometimes could be ego and somebody thinking, well, I don't want to share this thing that wasn't a home run. But there's a lot to be learned there. A lot of value can come from that, and a lot of resources can be saved and put into other things versus repeating mistakes, repeating things that maybe didn't work out perfectly. So I appreciate you sharing that. That gives me something to think about, as do all these conversations. One more question for you. I told you we could talk for like 3 hours.
I can do it. you can tell I go long.
No, I love it, man. I'm always interested in what books, podcasts, just anything of interest that I could either enjoy myself or link so that people listening could enjoy. But I'd love to know what books have been important to you over the years. And they don't have to be conservation focused. It could be novels. But do any good books come to mind that you would recommend that have played a big part in your personal and professional lives?
Well, recently, I think, and you'll, I think, appreciate this experience, but having a 4 and a 2-year-old has meant that...
It shuts it down.
Yeah, reading actual paper books. There was a point there where I was just, I was steadfast in saying, no, I'm going to stick to paper books. I'm going to read. I'm going to make time. And I think I got through like one book in maybe 9 months. I was like, this is holy.
No, I've been there, man.
I give up.
That's the right. You just got to take a break. I get it.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think the transition largely has been to audiobook podcast over the last few years. And that's been great because, if I'm making kids lunch or whatever.
Washing dishes.
Dishes.
That's all
bottles.
I do is wash dishes.
Yeah. Yeah. Laundry, all the stuff. I can just do that. So I certainly have some recent thoughts to share. I mean, I think it's funny going all the way back. I think I certainly was always drawn a little bit more kind of to the sci-fi fantasy space, even maybe it was Mossflower. Anyway, there was a series when I was younger that was, is very kind of classic fantasy kind of stuff, but the characters were, mice and badgers and rabbits. And I think for some reason, because they were, creatures rather than humans, they're non-human creatures, I think it made it like really engaging for somebody who has, I think, a little bit of that kind of natural kind of bent. So I think a little bit about that. I mean, and I would say that there's a kind of theme there that might carry through. I mean, one book that stands out almost just out of pride for being able to get through all of it is The Power Broker.
I've got that. I just got it out in my little office, and
it's
I'm scared of it.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
It looks at me all day. I'm like, I don't know if I can get involved in that.
And I mean,
being in New York though, that's mandatory reading.
Right. I mean, it's 1,200 pages, and that alone, but the pages are twice the size of a regular page, and font is half the size. So you're talking about, 5,000 page book, but it's an incredible book. I think it's an incredible book in thinking about cities, thinking about power. Certainly, I mean, it's in the title, but it was a unique circumstance where, Robert Moses just collected, 3 positions of incredible power that gave him so much, I think, just command over how a city is shaped. I think it highlights, a lot of the tensions between that kind of neighborhood orientation versus the need for large infrastructure investment, how you actually get that done. I mean, that's absolutely all kind of something that sits in the back of my mind. And I was lucky, I guess, to have an hour each way commute to my job for 4 years, though, and was able to get that done. It still took a ton of time.
I really want to read it, but I don't know what I'm going to do.
It's a commitment. It's fantastic. It's somehow, one of those rare authors, I think, that is able to balance that kind of real detail orientation around, but also that depth and engaging kind of nature in what could be a pretty boring space if you're not a great writer. That's one, I think, over time that certainly endures. One over the last few years that endures is Grant. So the biography of Ulysses S. Grant, I think, the narrative so many times in like the AP Euro books or AP, history books kind of stuff.
That's is it Chernow?
Yeah, Ron Chernow.
Yeah.
Yep. And that was great. I think similarly large, not probably fonts page-wise, but daunting, but great audiobook. And I think what was compelling there, right, is that I think just providing that depth and space for a character that I think is often characterized as, President, after Lincoln, played a role in the war and had some issues with alcohol, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's usually the kind of the takeaway. And I think the story there is so much deeper around, I think, just that humans' humility, persistence in the face of, I think, lots of egos, pride, self-interest, steadfast commitment to the country, I think ingenuity as a general, I think deep conviction and commitment to democracy, and then that commitment to public education as that fundamental core of how we ensure we have a strong democracy. That all came through and sits and really resonates. And I think it reminded me and continues to remind me of that need to listen, be curious, and not let that little soundbite of a human's life be the only thing you take away. I mean, again, like that second part of that soundbite, yeah, he certainly had some interesting relationships with alcohol, but I think there's so much more to one human. And I think it's, again, comes back to those kind of themes that we've talked about today around relationships and taking time and thinking about how we show up in a way that I think supports those values that we all share. So, yeah.
I've seen the Grant book, and that's one I'm also nervous. It's just, I do this reading list where I send out every 2 months all the books I've read. And I think I've got this idea like I need to be reading more books. And one time I'm sending it out, it's just going to be Power Broker.
I like that.
But one recommendation for you that you might like.
I love it. Yeah.
I'm about 150 pages in, but it's a thick one. But same period is the new Frederick Douglass biography by Blight.
Okay, yep.
And
I've seen
I think it's called Prophet of Freedom.
Okay.
And I didn't know anything about Frederick Douglass. And it is fascinating. It won the Pulitzer Prize. So it's one of these that is fun to read, but it's dense. But such a interesting story. So if you like that time period,
I would love that.
It's a good one. All right, man. This is great. I'm so glad we connected. Thank you for coming down.
Thank you for taking the time.
Really.
I really appreciate it. It's an interesting format, and I would love to have been the one asking questions too, but I understand how it goes. So
no,
I really
I'm in
appreciate
charge. You have to answer my questions. Thank you so much. Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.